Hey guys, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. We're about God's wisdom for everyone. And as the name suggests, we want to go deep in the Bible, in theology, philosophy, culture, things that bear on a biblical worldview. How does it connect to our life today? So thanks for joining us. And if this is helpful for you, we'd be grateful. Do all the things. Click like, share with a friend, leave a comment, leave any questions that you have. We'd love to respond to you that way. My name's Ryan. I'm sitting here with my friend Destiny.
Hey guys.
And we're in part 2 of a 3-part mini-series on the question, how should Christians think about Israel? The land of Israel historically, the modern state of Israel, current conflict in the Middle East. Super big topic. Lots of things come to bear.
Yeah.
In part 1 of this series, we kind of laid the table and we broadly looked at the history of that land. Of course, any history is going to be very contested, and people are going to say, wait, no, what about this? What about this? And that really gets to a big part of what we want to say in this 3-part series, which is this is a very complex reality. And deeper is a space for us and for listeners to be willing to interrogate even our own assumptions.
Yes.
And not just interrogate the Bible or the world, but to say, how did I land to where I land? Am I missing something?
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine that for everybody, as we talk about this very complex emotionally, issue, probably everybody's at some point going to feel some twinge of, boy, I don't know if I see it that way. And that's okay. That's by design. And among other things, Christian maturity means knowing how to disagree amicably and lovingly. So with that said, in this central part 2, we're going to try to square up to some big theological questions. What does it mean to say that God controls history?
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, why that little bit of land? Why is it special according to the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
And number 3, what does the name Israel even mean? That word Israel is not arbitrary. It is a rich icon almost of aspects of what that place, that people mean. And I think that could be something helpful to hold on to. So,
Awesome.
Destiny, so let's start with history. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any questions about it, or should I just jump in?
Well, I think for me, what's difficult when, especially thinking through the lens of this conflict, everyone wants to know, especially those who maybe would ascribe to a worldview that says God is involved in history. What does that mean, though? What does that mean on the ground, so to speak? Because we can say God's involved in history. We can say platitudes like, and this is not biblical, but everything happens for a reason, right? We throw things out like that to like make comments about how history is affecting us and how God is involved in it. And like God knows all. Like we kind of have these ideas about the nature of God as well as who God is and how he's interacting with history.
Yeah.
But especially in this conversation, when it comes to the topic of land and the conflict over the land, what are we supposed to be saying in terms of God's involvement in this? Like, is God provoking the nations going, I want to see this conflict go? Is God only in the peacemaking part of it? What does that mean that God is the God of history?
Yeah. A good friend of mine did his doctoral dissertation on that question. And
I'm sure that was fun.
I'm sure. I didn't read it, but
Terrible.
over pizza and drinks, sometimes I got the highlights.
Nice.
I like the word that you used, the word involved.
Uh-huh.
God is involved in history.
Yeah.
And that suggests a middle ground between 2 extremes. One extreme would be called deism, which is to say God's not involved in history. God is a hands-off, at a distance. If there is a God, he certainly doesn't care about us.
Yep.
He's not involved.
Yeah.
On the other end of deism is determinism, to say God is so hyper-involved that every little thing that happens is his design,
Right.
is
God.
his will.
God's behind it. Yeah.
But involved, I think the word you used really gets at that middle ground that we realized from page 1 of the Bible. God partners with humans in creating this world.
So there's what you're saying is there's an established agency both within humanity as well as within
That's
God.
right. That's right. As Blaise Pascal said, we are given the dignity of causality. I think
Mm.
C.S. Lewis may also have said that about prayer,
Hmm.
that part of why we pray is God gives us the dignity of creatures of affecting the world. We're not,
Mm-hmm.
puppets on strings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what that suggests, though, is that there's a persistent gap between the world as it would be if humans did everything God's way
Yeah.
and the way the world actually is.
Yeah.
This is the gap between the is and the ought.
Yes.
And that is very significant to think about. Someone like Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a famous 20th century American theologian, who's sort of known for realism, to say, for example, in his book Moral Man and Immoral Society, to say that groups of people, collectives of people, will always be obliged to do certain things that individuals would find ethically embarrassing, because that's the nature of history. And, like think about Romans 13, where it's saying, well, the government doesn't hold the sword for no purpose. That's the wrath of God. But what if you're a Christian governor? Well, in your capacity as governor, you're obliged to do certain things that you might not in your individual capacity, where we might say turn the other cheek.
Mm-hmm.
And so this part of
Okay,
the
got it.
challenge is
Yeah.
that the New Testament was written in a world in which Christians are a little tiny minority.
Yeah.
They weren't running the empire.
Yeah.
So the sorts of responsibilities and the sorts of decision making necessary for that wasn't in the picture.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of the God of history, I think one of the things that it obliges us to reckon with is our own finitude in terms of understanding what, if I think about knowledge of history, what I mean by knowledge and what we mean by God's knowledge are radically different things. It's the old metaphor. Here comes history as a parade. I look through a knothole in the fence. I see just a tiny little bit.
Yeah.
God sees over the fence.
Yeah.
So there's an incommensurable perspectives here. And part of being a Christian, or Jew, is coming to peace with your own limitations, particularly your own mental limitations. So trying to understand history has mystery involved. I would also point you to, there's a book by a philosopher, and his name is Lewith, is his last name, Lowith. It's called Meaning in History. And it's basically argues that modernity took over Christianity's historical narrative, because Christianity, in the basic move from creation to new creation, from this world to the eschaton in which God makes all things well, that history has direction at all. It's not in a circle. It's not static. It's in a direction, and that direction is good. Well, that's the narrative of liberal modernity. We are moving progressively towards good things. And so a lot of people have said, yeah, you basically stole our story.
It was hijacked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there would be other people who deeply, deeply disagree with that. Look up a guy named Hans Blumenberg, something like that. Some guy like that. Some guy disagrees with Lewith really hard.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people who are committed to say, we owe nothing to Christian legacy. We know nothing to a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
We wash our hands clean of that. It's wicked all the way through.
Yeah. There's a lot of secular voices actually that are coming out and saying, no, actually, we owe
sure.
a great deal.
Think of Tom Holland.
Yeah.
Who's Dominion.
Yes.
Basically is like, Christianity was like a nuclear explosion in the soil that goes down so deep you don't even realize it. But you wouldn't want to live in a world run by the Romans.
Yeah.
You would prefer a world where our sport is NBA basketball and not gladiators slitting each other's throat.
Yeah.
It's actually great to live in this world, and it's a Christian invention.
Mm.
Hospitals. Do you like hospitals? Yeah, Christians.
Yeah.
Do you like schools? Whatever. That's an exaggeration, but you get the point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't think it's going to ruffle feathers if you say not everything is as it ought to be. I think even a secular person could agree with that.
Yes.
I don't know that. I think that's boiling it down a little bit too much. I think you're adding more to the conversation. But I think what a lot of people are wondering is, what is God behind? Do you know what I mean? Like what
Yeah.
in terms of this conflict, do you really want to tell me that it's a trade-off that so many children have died in the Gaza Strip? Do you want to tell me that,
Right.
you know,
Right. Right.
for the families of the Israelis that were killed or raped
Yeah.
or harmed in whatever capacity on October 7th or previously or afterwards, like, do you really want to tell me that God is the God of history? It seems like you're almost trying to say to me that platitude, everything happens for a reason, or don't worry, like it's kind of a let's throw a blanket on it and
Right.
say God's in control.
Right.
It's okay.
Right.
And I don't think that that's what you're trying to communicate. But what then are we trying to communicate in response to, especially suffering
Right.
on both sides,
Right.
when we say God is the God of history? And for me, my reaction to that would say, well, there's more to the conversation than just simply that God is involved. I think it's important to talk about the kind of God that is involved and where God sees history going.
Yeah.
So do you want to speak to that?
I want to. um, man. Thank you for pressing us to always say, yeah, but how does it affect that person?
Yeah.
I default to the abstract.
Sure. No, well, and you know what?
Oftentimes.
I think this is an important exercise in doing theology because there are people down here, so to speak, on the ground, right? We're all living our lives here, that are, shaking their fist at the theologians up there in the Ivy League towers, right? If I'm just going to paint a picture of this. And they're saying, how does what you're talking about up there affect us down here?
Yeah.
Right. And, maybe the professor in the Ivy League tower says, hey, I'm not just sitting up here, twiddling my thumbs and having a nice time having drinks with friends talking about ethereal things. Ideas matter. And sometimes it takes time to really get to the bottom of something. And I'm doing that hard work. And how can we bring those two worlds together and say, the ideas have to lead to praxis, but praxis is impacted by ideas, and we have to be responsible with how we think about them. And we have to do the work of thinking about them before we just come to a conclusion. And the reason that I say that is because I don't think it's a bad thing that you're in the abstract right now, but I'm pushing because so many people are asking that question.
Yeah.
Where does that grab onto my life?
Yeah.
Where does that grab onto their life? How can I look that person in the eye and say these things? I'm willing to say them if they're true.
Yeah.
And if they're true, I would like to believe that means that they make sense with what I'm living.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. So I think with all ultimate type questions, Christians turn to the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
And so several things from the scriptures come to mind as a starting point to answering those questions. I think the point, beginning and end,
Mm-hmm.
is Jesus Christ killed
Mm.
in a horrible way by a state-sanctioned execution. And he didn't protest. He just went down. And the profound mystery of that, the absurdity of that, the creator killed by the creature, the inability for that to make sense is like the only thing that makes sense in face of the absurdity of human suffering. The Greeks developed a whole genre called tragedy,
Right.
that explored the fact that much of human existence is choosing between very bad options and falling into the very pit you try to escape. And so I think among the reasons I'm a Christian is that in the whole question of theodicy, how can a powerful, good God allow suffering?
Mm-hmm.
The Christian God isn't going to give you a syllogism. The Christian God's going to shut up and weep with you. That doesn't mean there's no such thing as justice. That doesn't mean there's no such thing as blame.
Mm-hmm.
But it does mean that we're dealing with something here that verbal formulas are not satisfactory. You need something deep. You need an experience of solidarity, of love, of empathy. So, I mean, that's the death of the Messiah, the death of God incarnate, is the place to start and end. But as that event is given us in the Bible, it is connected to a host of other things in the Bible. And so it's important to explore those.
Mhm.
Dominant of which is the history of the people of Israel, who, Jesus is taking into himself the consequence of their covenant unfaithfulness, the full force of exile, all this kind of stuff. A major passage in the Old Testament comes right at the end of the Torah. In ancient literature, beginnings and ends are very high target areas for like the point of the whole thing.
Okay.
So at the end of the Torah, Moses is on his deathbed, and he basically says, he's given his life to these people. He's given them the law. He's whatever. And he basically says, I know as soon as I die, you guys are going to go bonkers. You're going to totally reject the covenant, and it's not going to go well for you. And so he gives this song. He says, I want to teach you this song because this song is going to bear a witness to you, against you for that day. And he basically tells this story. God found you. You were an orphan, bleeding and gross out in the desert, but God took you and he beautified you and he made you perfect in you. And he set you on a good path. But then Israel grew fat and kicked and said, I'm going to do it my own way. And so God says, well, I'm going to raise up another nation to discipline you. This is where history comes in. God's saying, I'm going to raise up the Assyrians, or this is how people in Isaiah's day are understanding this. I'm going to raise up the Assyrians. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. They're going to punish you. But then that foreign nation will in turn become filled with pride, and I'm going to destroy them too. And then there will be a faithful remnant of my servants, and I will vindicate them. And so, and that template, Deuteronomy 32, has been called a compendium of prophetic theology. That is, it is the implicit narrative in the background of much of the formal prophetic writings of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the book of the 12. The reason I'm mentioning all this is to say the assumption of these ancient Jewish writers is that God is in charge of history.
Yeah.
God is behind the raising up of Cyrus to overthrow the Babylonians because he's going to release the people and say, go build the house of the Lord.
Yeah.
Whether that sort of causal influence of God continues from a Christian perspective after the close of the Bible is an interesting question. And to be honest, I don't have a super clear answer for that. I don't have a clear answer because the answer is complex, not because there's no answers. A book that I have found enormously helpful is by Oliver O'Donovan, Oxford theologian. It's called The Desire of the Nations: Rediscovering the Roots of Political Theology. It is a very deep, sophisticated, beautiful analysis of the questions, basically questions surrounding power. Christianity for about 1,000 years in Europe, give or take from, let's say, 500 to 1500, kind of ran the government. The Pope had secular jurisdiction.
Yeah.
We've tried that.
Yeah.
And there were some good spots. There were some not good spots. Yeah. But it's not like Christians have never said, geez, what would happen if Christians ran the world? That's happened.
We're saying that right now in American politics.
Yeah. So, yes.
Sorry, that was a little spicy, but I'm just saying.
No,
we're still saying that.
It is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. So all that to say, history, I want to come back to Niebuhr. Also somebody who's been helpful for me is Thomas Sowell at Stanford, whose book, A Conflict of Visions. He let me just give a little blurb on this. He says, of all the different sort of political philosophies and so forth, they kind of go into two buckets. He makes all the qualifications, but he's like, nonetheless, two buckets. One is called the constrained vision, and one is called the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision assumes that we live in a world of limits. We are constrained by our circumstances, by geography, culture, death, variety of things, resources, yes. The other, which is very much a sort of a modern Enlightenment, Western viewpoint, it says unconstrained, which is to say, no, actually, we can perfect this world on our own steam. Yeah, exactly.
Nowhere but up.
Well, it's this progressive, or it's this secularized eschatology. And
that's an apt way to put it. I've never heard it like that.
I didn't come up with that. I've heard a lot of people talk about it.
No, but it's
secularized
helpful.
eschatology. Yeah. Absolutely. And so Thomas Sowell basically says, when there's problems in the world, people with the unconstrained vision, they want to find perfect solutions. Just fix it. Everything's fixable. If we just have the smartest enough people in the room, we'll fix everything. People of the constrained vision say, there are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs.
Hmm.
There are not perfect thread the needles that make no, that's history as we want it, but it's not history as we find it.
I think that's maybe hitting the nerve that I was getting at earlier, because I think the natural human frustration that comes from hearing God is in control of history
Yeah.
is this idea that, like, but what if I think God isn't doing his job right?
I know.
And I think that that's where that comes from. And that's why we say, no, there has to be an answer, because the one that says that there are some trade-offs and this is not going to be clean, like this is not just going to be a very boom, boom, boom. We worked it out.
Right.
Everything's got its place and it's neat.
Mhm.
I think we kind of want to shake our fists at that and
Right.
say, like, no, I think it's possible. That's at least maybe that's a more modernist view or a more progressive view. And maybe because I swim in that water here in America,
Yep.
that's what is coming from me. I don't know. I can't speak for other cultures that would be the reaction, but at least in the here and now for me, I that's a strong one, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The yearning is correct. The yearning is very biblical. The yearning is to say, I want the world to be well. And God, I believe in you, so why isn't it not well?
Mhm.
That's a right yearning. I think things the Bible would say you need to revisit are, for whatever reason, God's commitment to work through human beings.
Yeah.
I don't know why he decided to do that, but he actually is not going to uh, withdraw responsibility from us.
Mhm.
That's why when he saved the world through Jesus, he came as a human. He didn't come from without.
Mm.
I mean, he did, but he didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing is to understand the depth of sin, actually. The depth of hubris, civilizational hubris, group egoism, singular egoism, uh, sin as it manifests personally, collectively,
Yeah.
and then in all the mediating institutions.
Yeah.
So we live in a complex world, and the wrong response is to say, well, if I can't make it perfect, then I'm just not going to try at all.
Mm. Mhm.
That's frankly juvenile.
Mm.
It's really black and white thinking. I think you got to make the best of what we can do here. And so this is again where, man, to bring it back to Israel, and what I'm about to say, some people will agree with me, some people will really disagree with me. I feel tremendous empathy for civilians in the Gaza Strip who are dying, but I think that I personally see the cynicism of the leaders of Hamas as ultimately responsible for that, because they are using people as a human shield. When you set up a headquarters in a children's daycare, you are cynically using the lives of the innocent for your own PR campaign. And I find that wicked.
Mhm.
And I think the Israeli government has been overboard about trying to be a very ethical government, or an ethical army
Mhm.
that does all sorts of internal reviews. I'm pretty sure Hamas isn't going to be doing an internal review of whether they're fighting ethically or not.
Mhm.
Um, but let me just try to, we've kind of leaped domains. I want to try to
Yeah.
draw these together.
Thanks.
To believe in the God of history, and even as that pertains to the people of Israel, does not mean then you are obliged to endorse every decision of every Israeli government
Mhm.
or something like that,
Mhm.
um, because that is run by fallible humans. And just, I mean, it probably goes without saying, but it needs to be said, in terms of, the bloodshed in that part of the world and all over the world. There's no perfectly innocent party at the state level. Now, if say, God forbid, but it's happened, a little 7-year-old girl dies, she's innocent. She has no complicity. She's an innocent victim. But when it comes to looking at two peoples, there is no pure innocence.
Mhm.
Everybody's brilliant. The inner lawyer, the inner PR campaign is really, really good at
Mhm.
saying, me victim, you victimizer. And both sides can legitimately say that. And I think God in heaven weeps. I think the cross is the most profoundly eloquent statement of solidarity with suffering humanity. Um, and the resurrection is the most hopeful statement because it's not hope that ignores death.
Mhm.
It is hope that goes straight through the heart of the most tragic, unjust death.
Mhm.
And so, um, ultimately, as Christians who believe the resurrection has already begun, and by the way, Jews believe in the resurrection too, or they
Mhm.
should.
Yeah.
And my doctoral advisor has written a great deal about this. But the resurrection is the ground of our hope, but it is a sober hope. It is a hope that has squared up to the brutality of history. Jesus's life does not exist on a mythological plane like other rising and dying gods and or
Mhm.
dying and rising, He's
Yeah.
not the corn god with the cycles of the he grew up in a world where there's infectious diseases and, you know, dogmas from on high at large distant places that are coercive, and he grew up in history.
Mhm.
And so I really do think that profound reflection on Jesus and journeying with Jesus a- are the inputs for the sort of knowledge that is appropriate when we think about this mystery.
Mhm.
And it is a mystery.
Mhm.
What Soren Kierkegaard said about our own personal lives probably applies to history as well. Soren Kierkegaard said, we we have to live we live our lives forward, but we can only understand it backwards.
Mhm. Yeah.
In the moment, it's like, I don't understand how this works.
Right.
But then you look back over the last 10 years and you're like, wow, God, that went well.
Mhm.
I would imagine there's some dimension of history. And I don't just mean Western Bible influenced history. I mean, I'm talking about like Chinese history, Japanese history, African history, Slavic history, like history, capital H.
Mhm.
Um, that I do believe that someday when God makes all things well, that it will make sense
Mhm.
in a way that we maybe can't now fathom. And just because we can't now fathom it doesn't mean that anticipating that is a pipe dream.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of things that don't understand that are nevertheless very real. Personally, I don't understand how the sun works. I don't understand the fission or fusion or whatever it
Right.
is. Other people do, and that's great. I
Mhm.
don't. But does that mean I don't believe in the sun? No, I very
Right.
much believe in it.
Yeah.
So my own limitation isn't the sort of the touchstone of whether or not something can be real or not.
Yeah.
But this is a fundamental issue, God's relation to history. We should probably move on though and try to touch a
Yeah.
couple of. But do you have any questions
No,
or on that whole topic?
to close, I think, at least on that topic, I think there can easily be a fixation with delineating where to shift the blame.
Oh,
Does this one
totally,
go to God and that one goes to
totally,
you and that one goes to me?
totally.
And there's far more gosh, I'm trying to remember who this was, but I remember there was a book on sin that I was reading that kind of broke open the paradigm that I had for sin that was like, oh, sin is just kind of what lives in individuals sometimes and does bad things through people or whatever. It was
Mhm.
just a very basic, but realizing that there's such a complexity to the way that sin is in the world
Mm.
and how that impacts the events that happen. And there's no way for any one human to say, this little piece goes over here and you're to blame for that, and this goes over here. And like whole communities can be in sin, individuals can be in sin, the
Yep.
way that God responds to sin. It just, it's all not too complex to ever understand, like you said, but to recognize what a deep mystery all these things that play in the world are, and to say, not that we can't say anything about it, but to try and pick it apart the way we would a frog in a science lab isn't necessarily the way to do it. And what I hear you saying is take some time rather than to like neurotically go through that process of trying to, you know, delineate everything. And instead, fix your eyes on the resurrection. Meditate on the story of scripture, meditate on Jesus, meditate on the resurrection and what that could mean for what you don't know.
Yes.
And for what you feel and can't even describe with your words.
Mhm.
Um anyways, that was powerful for me because I often find myself in that place just trying to like,
Yeah.
well, where does the blame go and where does the, and where's the justice and all
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
It's beyond me.
Yeah. And I mean, Destiny, you've got an undergraduate degree and a
Hmm.
master's degree. You're among the most educated people in this world. I mean, like statistically, that's totally true. And
But it's sad
and you find
because I'm so
well,
limited.
and you find it hard. But here's the point.
Yeah.
Here's the point. Maybe the Bible sheds light on this.
Yeah.
Maybe we humans aren't designed to know to have the knowledge of good and evil. Maybe when we
Oh.
reach out to grasp the knowledge
Yeah.
of good and evil,
Yeah.
God's saying, you fundamentally can't get that. And now your thirst for what you cannot quench is
Mhm.
going to be your curse. You're going to drink salt water and you're going to get thirstier and thirstier. And so, I mean, this is among the things of the Genesis story, that part of the tragedy of the human race is that we're not designed to apportion blame. We're not designed to
Mhm.
adjudicate good and evil. And
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for, adjudication.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah. And I mean that very trope in the Bible is made complex. Solomon talks about knowing good and evil, and it's seen as a good, important thing. It comes up in Isaiah, comes up in Proverbs. I mean, like, so it's sort of like, well, we got to roll with it now because this is where we're at.
Yeah.
But if you try to understand what is the significance of my confusion itself,
Mm.
what does the fact that I can't come to an answer here indicate?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Maybe maybe the question is unanswerable in with the equipment that I have and am. And
Yeah.
and that's a very important thing to consider.
Mhm.
And to not consider it from a religious standpoint is delusional, and to make an idol of yourself. You know,
Yes.
so
Yes.
I'm not
Okay,
saying you're
so
doing that,
no,
but
no, I'm hearing you loud and clear, and I'm sure I have done it at one point, or I will. Um,
no.
but okay, in light of that, we're also all trying to understand why what's up with this small piece of land? Why is it causing so many problems?
Yeah,
Why is it so important? And I think we want to approach that question from a biblical theological standpoint.
yeah,
What has it meant, and what does it mean now?
yeah,
The land.
yeah. I mean, yeah, because on the face of it, it's like, why do we care so much about this rocky
Yeah,
little, crappy little I mean, the first century geographer Strabo wrote about Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, like, this place, nobody would fight for it. Nobody
sure,
would want it. It's
sure.
junky. And yet history has proven him very wrong.
Hmm.
Everybody's fought for it.
Yeah,
But at a certain level in the Old Testament world, there are cats and there are mice. Cats are in the
the
Egyptian
big
Empire.
dogs. Yeah,
They prowl wherever they want. The mice scurry around in and out of their
mm,
holes.
yeah. Have
And
little skerfuffles over here, but then
Jerusalem Jerusalem
yeah,
is a mouse hole. It is not a cat's lair.
sure.
And all the little wars between the Israelites and the Philistines and the Edomites and the Moabites these are rats
Yeah,
fighting. Solomon at best is a rat.
sure.
He's not a cat.
Uh-huh.
And so, uh, from an historical standpoint, part of the audacity of biblical faith is that the Bible says, well, all the stuff going on in those big old empires, that's a sideshow. What's
Mhm.
really the real action of the creator in this world is in this little marginal, tiny little hill people called the Israelites. That's audacious. And yet,
Yeah.
another way to look at it is to say, no, no, no. This is a master stroke of God's genius, because this coveted land bridge
Mhm.
that was constantly fought over because it was a thoroughfare to larger pastures for
Mhm.
empires, it was a seeding ground for the gospel, for truth. Like, you see these terrorist movies, and the terrorists have a nerve gas and they're getting under the building and they're like, we're gonna go get into the HVAC system because we
Mm.
just pour it
Right.
into that one hole
Yeah.
and it's gonna distribute
Right.
to every
Yeah.
it's like that.
Yeah.
It's a strategic place. Um, let's shift gears and let's talk about, from a biblical perspective, why this land is special.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's some really, really important stuff here. Um, and it fundamentally comes down to the idea of temple. So when you read Genesis 1 through 3, remember we did a whole series on Genesis.
Mhm.
One of those episodes was called Our Temple Shaped World.
Right.
Why did we call it that? What It's because the language in Genesis 1 and 2 are framed in such a way that to ancient Near Eastern ears, it is very clear that the universe is being constructed as a giant temple. a place for God to dwell,
Mhm.
or a place where there's an overlapping interaction between God and humans, the creator and the creation. Now, in the history of Israel, two special buildings, the tabernacle and the temple, are designed in such a way to echo and in many ways recreate Eden. There's a great deal of scholarship on this. I would suggest a book. It's edited by a guy named Morales. It's called Cult and Cosmos, something about a temple tilted theology or something. It's a collection of essays. But the basic idea, there's a lot of granular scholarship showing, those long architectural passages in Exodus and in First Kings, and then you shall cut the threads this way, and
Right.
there's so many cubits and
Tons
blah
of
blah blah. You're like,
specificity.
why the
Yeah.
heck is this in the
Yeah.
Bible?
Yeah.
Because it's connecting these structures to the Garden of Eden and to creation.
Mhm.
So it's saying these are a microcosm of the whole of the universe. Or you could see it the other way, is that the universe is a macrocosm of the temple. So the key link then is to understand how this temple thinking and the temple in Jerusalem was seen to actually compress into one space that which is true of the whole land. That is, it is a temple land. Remember when, Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, cherubim put on the east side. When the Israelites are coming back in, early Joshua, right before the first battle of Jericho, weird encounter with a person called the commander of the armies of the Lord. Take off your shoe. This is holy ground. Your shoes. Are you for us or against us? Neither. I'm
Right.
the commander of the Lord's army. Joshua's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's almost like re-encountering the cherubim on the east of the Garden of Eden,
Hmm.
entering back into
Oh,
the whole
okay.
domain.
I
And
see how that maps on.
in
Yeah.
rabbinic
Yeah.
thinking, Eden is Jerusalem. And also in early Christian
Yeah.
thinking, this is why in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem today, right under Calvary, there's a thing called Adam's Chapel. And there's a fissure in the earth, and the legend
Yes, I've seen
is
that.
that this is where Christ's blood trickled down from Golgotha,
Oh,
touched
I see.
the skeleton of Adam, and he rose again. So that there's this not just literary typology, but sort of like historic typology between Christ, first and
Gotcha.
second Adam.
Mhm.
Be that as it may, the big idea is this is a temple land. This is a place that is a unique hotspot overlap between God's realm and humanity's realm. And this is how the idea of the Holy Land, we've heard that phrase, the Holy Land. Where does that come from? It comes from bringing together these multiple ideas, the idea of creation, the idea of temple, the idea of this whole place, at this whole region. So it's not just a bunch of rocks. It's like the place near, we've used the metaphor of the nuclear reactor.
Right.
God's presence is enormously powerful and beautiful and useful, provided you approach it correctly,
Mhm.
provided you have the right protocols.
Mhm.
It's like a giant x ray machine that when you're in this place, we all become transparent. God knows our hearts, God knows our secrets, good, bad, and ugly. And the other thing is that in ancient Israelite thinking, as we mentioned in the last episode, when you immigrate to Israel from anywhere in the world, you make an aliyah, you go up.
Right. The ascent.
Yeah. And in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 5, uh, elsewhere, he talks about Israel is at the center and all the nations are around her. Israel's like the navel, the belly button
Mhm.
of the world.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of ancient maps that
Sure.
have Jerusalem at the center. And the Israelites aren't alone in thinking that. The ancient Chinese, they always called their kingdom the Middle Kingdom.
Mm.
Because we're at the
Right.
center and everybody else, we don't need to go to you. Come to us.
Uh-huh.
We're at the center. The ancient Romans thought the same. But the difference is that unlike ancient China or Rome, the Israelites are a tiny, tiny little country that say, and yes, the Lord of the universe is active here. So in terms of thinking about why this bit of land, I believe it has to do with the idea of God's promises and God's presence are uniquely affiliated with this. God owns all the world,
Mhm.
but this is the place he has chosen to create an oasis of order, of holiness, of wisdom, of covenant in the world that has largely rejected him. this is the place that God has chosen to do that. And for Christians, that phase of the story in many ways comes to closure in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean, therefore, it's now irrelevant and who cares. And we'll talk about that more in the next episode as we talk about the
Oh, yeah, I
status
got lots of
status
questions.
of the covenant,
Yeah.
because that's a
Yeah.
huge and complex issue. But let's wrap by quickly reviewing this word Israel itself.
Yeah, tell me about how the name Israel
Yeah.
supposedly holds some weight with how we think about the land.
Well, I think it does. So here I'm actually not quoting anybody.
Convince me. No, I'm just
Okay.
kidding.
Well, we don't have a ton more time, but so those words in those letters in Hebrew, it's Yud, Sin,
Mhm.
not Shin, Sin. If you know Hebrew, you'll know what I mean. Yud, Sin, Resh, Aleph, Lamed, Israel. The etymology of that word doesn't just have one biblical gloss. So I'll just run you through three, actually, 3/4. In Genesis 32, Jacob's on his way back to the promised land. And right on the border, right before he meets his estranged brother Esau, he wrestles through the night. And at some point, there's he gets jumped by this angelic patron, and Jacob's fighting him. But then at some point in the night, there's a shift, and instead of trying to get him away, he's actually hanging on and saying, "I'm not going to let you go until you bless me." And the blessing comes in the form of a name. He says, "You've called Jacob, but you're not going to be called that. You're going to be called Israel, for you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed." And the root there is in Hebrew the root for strive, sarah, is under this idea of Yisrael. You've striven with God and with man.
Yes.
So this is identity of wrestling vertically with God, horizontally with others. To be Israel is to be a wrestler. It is not. It's not relaxing, but it is engaged. The second one, and this is a shout out to Yair Zakovich at the Hebrew University who helped me see this. If you switch one of the letters from a sin to a shin, which is not switching the letter, it's just switching the dot over it. Some of the prophets, I'd have to check my sources, maybe Micah, seem to understand this as Yeshar El, which means God is honest, God is straight. And the basic idea is, Jacob, you've been a crooked guy.
Right.
Your life has kind of been like this. Nevertheless, God's honesty is the overriding idea here. And I think Zakovich has a different interpretation of this. I interpret it to say, notwithstanding the exilic, winding nature of Israel's story, there is something of God's straightness about it, God's uprightness about it, that this is how God works in our world through all the complexity on the ground. The third one, the third meaning comes from Genesis 35. Jacob is named twice. And when the Bible doubles something, that's often its way of doubling down. It's its way of saying, like, pay attention. Yeah, so Genesis 35, it talks about, and Jacob had come from Padan Aram, and it's this naming ceremony again. And in that naming ceremony, there's a lot of language from early Genesis of the sort of the creation mandate to flourish, to rule, and you shall be fruitful and multiply, and kings shall come out of you, and blah, 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 blah. And it would seem that in the background there of the name Israel is the root sarar, which is sin resh resh, which is the root of the idea to rule. Like the name Sarah, my wife's name, means princess.
Yes. Yeah.
Sarah in Hebrew. Sar means prince. And so Yisrael could either mean like God reigns or prince of God. And so it could either point to who God is or who Jacob is. But here's the point.
Thematically, those both fit.
They do.
Yeah.
And I think here's I think at the deepest level, the way that I view the land of Israel, or I want to, is this is the royal land. This is the land of a people, Exodus 19:6, who are a royal priesthood. This is the people of the Messiah. This is the point, the privileged point from which God chooses to initiate his kingdom in and for the world.
And also enter history later on in the
Yeah,
story.
no, that's what I'm
Yeah.
referring to, actually. That has happened.
Yeah.
And so I think it is a place that it is mysterious, but it is a mystery that circles around things about about human identity itself, the wrestling nature of what it means to be human, the royal mandate of what it means to be human, and yet acknowledging the sovereignty, the straightness, the goodness of God nevertheless.
Yeah.
And so I see it as a sort of, you hold up a diamond in the light and it gleams different colors. I think that very word Israel is like a semantic diamond that gives us angles on the mystery of this place that equip us to wrestle with its tragedy, with its intractability, with its mesmerizing. I mean, a lot of people go to Israel and say, this is unlike any place I've ever been. This is like an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a special place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my experience.
Yeah.
And um, I think I think it is well named with a word that helps us come to grips with what this place means.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the next episode, we'll talk about what does it mean for a Christian to say,
Yes.
I too am part of Israel. I too am, that's my name.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's where, because at the beginning I was like, how does this name have anything to do with the land? And so it's coming together for me.
Mm-hmm.
I see what you're saying. And this is kind of a tee up for the next talk, but
Mm-hmm.
I think where many Christians might feel a little bit of disjointedness is not in any disagreement with what you've said, but more that that has been said so much about the church proper. Um,
Like what parts?
the parts about being a royal priesthood unto God.
Well, that's Peter.
Ruling,
First Peter says that.
Right. But ruling, getting land, inheriting the world. Like there's kind of this missional
Triumphalism
aspect.
is the word you're looking for.
Yeah, there's a missional aspect and background to what you've described, but you're also saying that was, for lack of better words, incubated in the story of Israel. And I think what we've done, and this is maybe, again, nodding a little bit too much at supersessionism right now. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the next conversation. But where we're forsaking Israel entirely to say, well, now humanity that believes in faith on Jesus has taken over all that means. And now you can't talk about Israel at all because they've kind of poof disappeared within the larger conversation of humanity being redeemed. And so that's what I'm trying to express is like so much of what you were just describing about Israel is how we talk as Christians about ourselves Gentiles. And yet you're making a case that like this still lives uniquely, like there's kind of a yes and this still lives uniquely in God's chosen people. They haven't been unchosen. And so I think that's where the rub comes is for Christians, they're like, it's not that I want God to forget about Israel or, say, to hell with you guys or something like, but also what about us? And like, don't you say that about us? So does Israel disappear in the mix with us? Or is there still some level of uniqueness to Israel and thus the land? Because, yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes more than sense.
So we will talk about that in our upcoming episodes.
I heard a Jew say to a Christian not too long ago, like, do you not realize that I exist? Like, I'm right here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we're going to talk about all that in the next episode.
Nice.
But I hope that this has grounded us in some ways of thinking about history, ways of thinking about temple, creation, covenant, ways of thinking about the unique identity of being the people of God. That can help us have something positive to say, something to grasp onto as we think about this. So we'll put a pin in it there, and next time we'll hit a bunch of good stuff. So
awesome.
You want to close us out?
Sure. Friends, thanks so much for listening. We're actually, Deeper is a part of the Bay Church. We're a ministry of the Bay Church here in the Bay Area, Concord, California. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, we would love that you shared it with some friends and followed us on Instagram. Check out our website. Guys, we do this because we want to serve you. So leave some comments. Tell us what you think about what we're saying and ask some questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. As the rabbis say, shalom, my friends. Shalom, homies. Take care.